Hello, my name is Cameron Yamamoto, and this is my CRJ 306 Minority Youth and Crime presentation. So, before I begin, I'm going to attach a PowerPoint presentation along with the YouTube link. And before I go any further, you should download the PowerPoint and have it open. If you don't already, I would pause the presentation. And now I'm going to begin. So, the second slide here, defining the problem. So, minority and juvenile crime. First, we have to identify that there is a problem. So, I'm going to go over what we know in regards to juvenile and minority crime. So, colored minors are detained at a higher percentage rate than Caucasian offenders. African Americans make up to 32% of juvenile arrests and represent 16% of the population. And Latinos are 28% more likely to be detained, and that statistic is as of 2016. So, even though, as is noted in the next slide, Caucasian juveniles have a higher rate of delinquency, colored minors are detained at a higher percentage rate, which indicates that there is a disproportionality of colored minors who are being detained versus Caucasian juveniles who are being detained. So that at least statistically proves that point. The next point I have here are colored minors are more likely to garner harsher sentences, including being waived out of the juvenile justice system. And so, just to take a quick summary, being waived out of the juvenile justice system means that a juvenile will be charged under an adult sentence. And though they may serve in a juvenile facility, oftentimes they may also serve in an adult facility, which serves its own set of problems. But it's just showing that there is a problem, as I have put it in the title, that there is a systemic discrimination between minorities and specifically juvenile minorities, as 8.6 times more likely is highly statistically significant as a result. So there is a problem, there is a systemic discrimination. So, moving on to the third slide, I have the question posed: why specifically focus on juveniles and crime, and more specifically, why focus on minority juveniles and crime? So, the first point I have there are that juvenile offenders are at their peak offending age. So, the time in one's life when someone is the most likely to offend is when they're a juvenile. So that is going to be the highest population of offenders. And if you were to create a program, utilize a program, create a policy change, one that's targeted at juveniles specifically, will target the highest population if it needs to be specifically targeted to one population. So the next point I have is that juvenile crimes are more receptive toward targeted policy change and rehabilitation in comparison to policy changes toward adult offenders. So, through my research, which is referenced on the last slide, it was mentioned that policy changes in a controlled amount of time, and although it didn't mention, I assume with a similar amount of resources, uh, created a decrease in adult crime by 14.1%, but similar policy changes in the same amount of time, in which I assume they used the same amount of monetary resources and time, it decreased juvenile offending rates by over 50%. And though it didn't specifically mention which crimes, violent, non-violent property, it's still a significant decrease, which shows that targeted policy changes are more likely to affect juveniles than adults. So not only are juvenile offenders the not the majority of the population, but not only are juvenile offenders a large portion of that population, but they're more easily changed than the adult offender population. So the next point I have here is that juvenile offenders cost the most money to detain. Therefore, cost-effective solutions would seek to reduce this cost. And so I came upon this conclusion through similar research, and I found that juvenile offenders who are waived into adult sentences and serve time at adult institutions often have to be in solitary confinement. And for someone to be in solitary confinement, it costs more building space, which costs more money. Juvenile offenders often have juvenile offenders, assuming a similar recidivism rate to adults, will be able to go to prison or jail more times than an adult offender, which will cost more money. And even things such as juvenile offenders need to eat more as they're growing, and they need to have certain services as required by jail and prison standards toward juvenile facilities, which cost more money. And additionally, juvenile facilities need to be constructed and separated from adult facilities, which in turn costs them more money as a lower percentage of the population is going to be in there versus an adult prison or jail. So the next point I have here is juvenile offenders are more vulnerable to abuse and harm when detained as compared to adults. And so it's important to target juveniles because the abuse they face in the criminal justice system is definitely more than the adults in a similar position. Not saying that adults don't face the problems, but a specific example would be sexual abuse. Minors in adult institutions, prisons, jails, are the number one target for sexual abuse. And oftentimes, these victims are targeted multiple times. Not only that, extended stays in solitary confinement have negative effects on one's mental state, which causes a higher rate of increased suicide attempts. And there are other varieties of physical, psychological, and abuse-based harm that can be done to a juvenile in detention, and specifically in adult detention, that wouldn't necessarily be done to an adult, which is the point as of why juvenile detention centers are created. But there's still a controversy between juveniles who are unfit for juvenile detention, but are therefore also unfit for adult detention. So the next point I have here is juveniles who are waived into adult sentencings have higher recidivism rates. So we want to focus on juveniles because they have higher recidivism rates, and this goes back to juvenile offenders cost the most money to detain. A juvenile who goes back to prison multiple times is a continued problem, not only financially, but they're I don't want to say this as they're a danger to society, but they present certain financial risks to society. Not only that, but they present certain risks to themselves, and they don't really provide as much work utility as someone who hasn't gone to prison, hasn't had a high recidivism rate can provide to society. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here, and it's why target juveniles continued. And this one is more regarding, the last slide is more regarding functional concerns. This one's more regarding ethical concerns. So juveniles in adult facilities are the most likely victims of sexual assault cases that I've mentioned before, so I'll skip over it. Juveniles in adult facilities often have to be segregated from general population in solitary confinement, which I've alluded to before as well. And though I was alluding more to the functional parts of it and how that would affect the rest of us, it still has major ethical concerns for the juveniles in there, which we should inherently want to decrease. And then the last ethical concern, which I have yet to mention, is a concept known as mens rea, or translated from Latin guilty mind. It is defined as the knowledge that one's wrongdoings are bad, and without which legally you cannot establish guilt. And it can be argued that youths lack this capacity, lack this guilty mind. And although that would not be argued in many cases, such as aggravated assault, murder, violent crimes, arson, things like that, this can definitely be argued for drug abuse, alcohol abuse, even sexual abuse in some cases when the child is incredibly young. And the reasons for this are that children don't necessarily children often don't understand the long-term effects of drugs or alcohol, nor do they understand adult sexual relations in a way that could that a court could say that a juvenile without a doubt would know that they're wrong. And although this is controversial, it's still an ethical concern as to why we might focus juveniles rather than adults in the criminal justice system. Alrighty, and so I know that was a lot to sorry, I know that was a lot to talk about here. So I'm just gonna briefly summarize what we've talked about in a conclusion. Okay, so juveniles are more susceptible to both criminality and policy changes. So not only do juveniles represent a significant portion of criminality, but they are also one of the easiest populations to affect via policy changes. Colored individuals are more likely to be incarcerated and more likely to be prosecuted more harshly. And that is a problem in regards to systemic discrimination and the functional side that those individuals are going to be spending more time, more often in prison than Caucasian counterparts. And colored juveniles are more likely to be waived to adult sentences, therefore costing more money via increased recidivism rates and funding for juvenile detention centers. And so the final point here that if I had to sum the whole thing up in one statement is therefore the juvenile justice, criminal justice systems, and community have a vested legal, moral, and financial interest in reducing the crime, arrest, and adjudication rate of colored minorities. So I'm going to move on to slide number 6, which is related theories. And this just builds a theoretical framework upon why why the problem as defined of minority juveniles exists. So I have two major theories listed here: routine activities theories, and as you can see on the diagram on the right, crime is generated when a likely offender, the absence of a capable guardian, and a suitable target coalesce. And strain theory, the next theory I've listed, is general strain theory asserts that a crime can be committed when noxious stimuli is introduced or when positive stimuli is removed, actual or threatened. So it doesn't need to actually be there. It could just be in their mind. And so why I chose these theories specifically to explain minority juvenile crime, I'll read the quote off here, but it is a phrase from Robert Sampson in Social Anatomy of Racial and Ethnic Disparities and Violence. Our theoretical framework does not view race or ethnicity as holding distinct scientific credibility as causes of violence. Rather, we argue they are markers for a constellation of external and malleable social contexts that are differentially allocated by racial ethnic status in American society. We hypothesize that segregation by these social contexts in turn differentially exposes members of racial ethnic minority groups to key violence inducing or violence protecting conditions. And so, how I have interpreted this is that crime is not caused by one's race, as might be interpreted by the research that has been presented such far, but crime is caused by social and structural factors in one's environment, of which are highlighted by routine activities theory, highlighting structural factors, and general strain theory, highlighting social factors. Moving on to slide number 8, I have the introduction of the particular program, of which the presentation is meant to, of which the presentation is meant to work with. So I have Big Brothers Big Sisters of America, and on the front, the first 3 columns there are snippets from the website, in particular from the mission statement. And then on the bottom, I have, in more theoretical terms, this program introduces a capable guardian and adds a positive stimuli while reducing negative stimuli, satisfying the conditions necessary in general strain theory and routine activities theory in order to prevent crime. So that's just explaining how the program works off the theoretical framework I've set before this. So, if it works based on theory, next we'll move on to how it functions in the real world. So first I'm going to begin with some structural facts about the program, and that is how it's funded. As one of the longest running social programs in the United States, it's been running for 100 years plus, Big Brothers Big Sisters of America affects communities all over the country, and it's funded via various sources, donations, corporate alliances, etc. So it's not biased in terms of who it targets, the population. Neither is it biased in terms of the results it publishes, so we can take its results at face value. Moving on to slide number 10. The real question, who cares if it's biased or not? Does it work? Does it work? And to cite a study in 1995 by Joseph Tierney, which was a blind study on 959 participants that tested a variety of variables, including the ones listed below. The study indicated a positive relation between Big Brothers Big Sisters program and positive fluctuations in each of these variables. And I use the term positive fluctuations to mean that it got the expected result. As school attendance, obviously you want that to be increased, but drug use, you obviously want that to be decreased. So I just term that as positive fluctuations. Essentially, the study found that in the experiment group, in a period of 18 months, the variables listed there had those positive fluctuations, whereas in a control group, they did not. And you can check the efficacy of that statement via the references page at the bottom of the presentation. So now I'm going to move on to slide number 11, and that is, can the program be improved? Major question of the presentation, can the program be improved? Though this program is a highly successful humanitarian effort, the extent to which the program can be implemented has room to extend. So I think the program is perfect as it is in regards to how it actually functions, but that program can be extended to fit a wider population. So according to the OJJDP, Journal of Juvenile Justice, Volume 5, Issue 2, reentry services have been given attention in the long-term success of juvenile justice programming. And so Big Brothers Big Sisters, when partnered with these reentry programs, would reduce alcohol and drug use among the population, which the study claims is a major reason for recidivism. So this study claims that drug use and alcohol abuse are contributing factors in recidivism. And according to the study before that, Big Brothers Big Sisters reduces that alcohol and drug use. Therefore, Big Brothers Big Sisters would inherently reduce recidivism among that group, at least in regards to those who recede due to drug or alcohol abuse. And by extending it to those programs, I feel that you can better improve the program. I'm going to move on to the final slide, the conclusion here. So I know we talked about a lot, but here is the basic gist of it. There are ethical, financial, and legal reasons to reduce crime, arrests, and adjudication among colored minorities. Those that we spoke of, ethical, mens rea, we spoke of sexual abuse, we spoke of solitary confinement, financial in the utility sense that it'll cost a whole ton of money to keep this pattern up, and legal reasons, including the mens rea, but also including the systemic discrimination, as that's inherently against constitutional values. These concerns can be met by social programs, specifically those that reduce recidivism, such as Big Brothers and Big Sisters of America. So, as has been highlighted by the Tierney study, Big Brothers and Big Sisters of America is effective, and it does work on reducing recidivism, as is noted by the ODJJ study mentioned later. And by expanding it to those individuals, you can reduce those ethical, financial, and legal concerns. And I have on the last slide here references where you can not only look up volunteer information or any other information regarding Big Brothers, Big Sisters, if you're interested, and I highly suggest you do, but you can see the other sources that I've used through my research, and you can check the efficacy of each one. And other than that, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.